Okay, so let's draw this diagram again. Thoughts, feelings, behavior, environment. Now let's imagine we'll draw a little eye here, and that's you. This represents you. Always remember this is a pattern. This represents you being inside the pattern, or in other words, being identified with it. And what this means is a big problem that most people make when they're figuring themselves out, or not even that, just in general, is that they identify themselves with their behaviors or their habits or their thoughts. They think, this is just who I am. They fall into destructive behaviors, they feel anxious all the time, and they just think, that's just me. I am an anxious person. I am an unmotivated person. I am a drinker. I am a smoker. They're identified with it. This is a big problem because when you're identified with your patterns and when you don't realize that you can actually break out of it and you're unaware, being identified, being stuck in your pattern equals dysfunction as a human, disconnection, so being disconnected from your body, anxiety. Anxiety can simply be thought of as being disconnected from your body. Your body's not in harmony. Anxiety, and then depression, and a slow disintegration. That's what happens when people don't develop self-awareness, don't develop self-control. That's what happens, and I've watched that firsthand. Be really vulnerable here. Pretty much both my parents are drinkers. One was a raging alcoholic. One was just a functioning one. They never really learnt self-control. They never learn about themselves. And now they live a very, very sad life, being lonely, no one around, still drinking, still smoking, depressed, anxious. I don't wish it upon my worst enemy, right? So I've seen it literally happen. How do we begin breaking this pattern? Right, you find yourself falling into, I know some of you guys talk about wanting to break unhealthy behaviors, develop more discipline, develop more self-control, all of that, and this is all to do with that, all right? Honestly, it doesn't matter figuring out your goals, your vision, your mission. I used to teach that to people first, but there's honestly no point if you don't understand how much your life is controlled by your program and by your unconscious. Your unconscious literally runs the show. We're going to get more into that. This is someone who's identified with their thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and environment. How we begin shifting this and becoming more aware is we do something called shifting the vantage point. Shifting the vantage point. What does that mean? It means we're taking our conscious awareness and we're moving it from being enveloped by our habits and our patterns and our behaviors. We're going to move our awareness out here. So that's I. So that's your awareness. So you're simply making a shift from being identified with your thoughts and everything that you do and your habits to now being the observer. Okay? In cognitive behavioral therapy, they call this cognitive diffusion. Right, so cognitive fusion, we'll say over here, cognitive fusion is when you're fused with your thoughts, your feelings, your behavior. You can't get out of it because you just think it's who you are. Cognitive diffusion is when you are defusing from everything. You're defusing from being identified with all of this. You're essentially loosening the grip. And what you're actually doing here, when you move from being inside of it to being the observer, so it's almost like you're observing what's happening without judgment, something happens. You create distance. You create distance. Distance equals choice. Or I should say conscious choice. Conscious meaning you're actually aware of what you're doing. So here's a space, right? So you've got your patterns, you've got your thoughts, you've got your feelings, and you get stuck in them sometimes. You know, you get stuck, you're like, oh, I feel like shit all the time, or having these thoughts, and it's a repeating loop. What we want to do is to start to loosen that grip a little bit. Create distance, and in the distance, there's a conscious choice. And what that means you're creating a space to choose a new thought, or to choose a new response rather than being emotionally reactive. You know, when someone says something that triggers you and you react, that's because you're identified with your patterns and your programs and your habits. You react unconsciously. So you say something that you don't mean. When you create space, you're creating a distance, you're creating a space to actually choose how you want to respond to a situation. So you're creating space, so you're loosening the grip of identity. And then what this leads to is something called psychological flexibility. That's what you want to develop, psychological flexibility. Just like if you look at someone who's physically flexible, they can bend, they can put their leg over their head. They're flexible, they can move, they can flow really well, right? What we want to do is essentially make our brain flexible, so adaptable. The more adaptable and flexible your psychology is, the more you're able to actually evolve and grow, right? And grow into who you can become.